Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to the New Books Network. My name is Leo Bader, and today we're talking to Emy Matesan, Associate Professor of Government at Wesleyan University. Matesan's new book, The Violence Pendulum, Tactical Change in Islamist Groups in Egypt and Indonesia, investigates 4 case studies to ask what makes Islamist groups use violent or nonviolent tactics, and what leads them to change these tactics. Looking at 2 groups in Egypt and 2 groups in Indonesia, Matesan traces the shifting tactics of each group to determine what factors influence tactical change and to find shared patterns. The conclusions she draws are relevant today beyond these 4 cases, perhaps most notably in the recent regime change in Syria, which has put a formerly violent Islamist organization in power and led many to question whether it will be capable of governing nonviolently. Emy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to start by discussing the theoretical framework that you use a little. You describe Islamic organizations as both principled and pragmatic. What does this mean, and what are the implications of this for studying tactical change?
Yeah, so actually started this project because it comes out of my dissertation. And when I started my dissertation, I very much operated with, I think, the prevalent framework, which is, at least in terrorism studies and among many scholars, which is to think of Islamist groups as strategic actors. They're rational, they're calculated, they use violence to pursue strategic goals. And my fieldwork led me to do interviews. And when you meet with members of Islamist groups, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood or other groups, you realize that just thinking of them as strategic doesn't quite capture what motivates them to act. And perhaps one of the biggest changes for me was to really move away from, there's still a lot of elements of strategic thinking. They're still very calculated in many ways at the organizational level and among the leadership. There's still a lot of calculation. But I think we miss the big picture if we ignore the very real religious motivations that inspire them and that move them on a day-to-day basis. So that then inspired me to slightly shift my analysis too. So I think of them as both principled and strategic in the sense of the ultimate mission is religious. They have very clear religious mission and religious goals. They want to see certain religious outcomes, but then how they achieve them are the groups can be very strategic about pursuing those religious goals. And it's impossible to truly separate the piety from the strategic calculations. At times you see that they act very strategically, and other times they take actions that may seem irrational or that may not seem beneficial to the group, but that for them are very much in line with their mission, with their vision, with their principles.
So the central focus of your book is what you call escalation and then de-escalation, which you further separate into ideological, organizational, and behavioral escalation or de-escalation. So break down for us what exactly these different kinds of escalation are and how they combine or interact with each other.
Yeah. So again, I think one of the main premises of the book is that violence isn't an identity, it's a tactic that you choose and that groups arrive to. And in conflict studies we talk about conflict escalation and conflict de-escalation. In terrorism studies, you often hear the terms radicalization and deradicalization. Now, I am coming very much from the perspective of radicalization and de-radicalization, but I'm not crazy about the terms radicalization and de-radicalization. So instead, I use the terms escalation and de-escalation to think about when is it that groups move towards violence as a choice, or away from violence. So a group doesn't just one day decide that that's it, we're embarking on a violent campaign if they're a nonviolent movement, right? So for me, the question is, how does a group arrive to that point where they are an armed group that that is embarking in a full-on armed struggle. Um, and you can unpack what it means to be a violent group or a group that engages in violence into multiple dimensions. One is the behavioral, and that's usually how we think about it. Does this group actually use violence right now? So that's the behavioral dimension. But what Omar Ashur, who wrote one of the first books on deradicalization, organizational deradicalization, points out is that there's also the organizational dimension. So does this group form an armed wing? And we can think of we can think of an armed wing as being an institutional dimension of pursuing armed resistance. So whether a group arrives to that point where they develop an armed wing, you know that there is an intention there to pursue violence more systematically than just sporadic violence. And then, of course, there's the ideological dimension. Does a group justify armed action? And under what circumstances and against which targets? And that is obviously a first step. It's an important first step. And sometimes you have groups that justify armed action and never go beyond that, right? They think that under certain circumstances, violence against certain targets is acceptable. That, of course, varies. For some groups, that's very limited. Violence against foreign occupation, for instance. For other groups, it is very expansive. Violence against civilians is acceptable if those civilians are seen as representing the enemy. So there's the ideological dimension, the organizational dimension, the behavioral dimension. The point is that you don't just get to the behavior out of the blue. A lot of times it goes in stages, but those stages are not necessarily linear. So you don't always have ideology, then armed wing, then violence. Sometimes you start with violence that is kind of spontaneous, emerging during riots or during protests. And then from there, then the group backtracks and starts justifying the violence and starts forming an armed wing. Other times you start with an armed wing. Other times, so the path can take. There can be multiple paths to pursuing more systematic armed campaign or violent campaigns. Now, on the de-escalation side, it can also look differently. So again, de-escalation, I think that's where perhaps it might matter even more to differentiate between these three dimensions, because a group may say that they renounce violence. How do we know that they mean it? Well, if they do not engage in violence, if they dismember their military wing, if they disarm, those are all pretty important signals that the group intends to, in fact, pursue nonviolent action over violent action. Reversely, sometimes groups don't engage in violence, so behaviorally they stop using it. Does that mean they're weak and they're not using violence because they don't have the capability? Does that mean that they intend to abandon violence altogether? Does that mean that counterterrorism has worked and has deterred them? So that's where, again, it's important to look at, well, have they offered any ideological revisions? In some cases, so one of the groups that I'm looking at, the Egyptian Jemaah Islamiyaa, they have published volumes and volumes of ideological revisions where they say, look, this is why violence right now is not working. This is why it's not justifiable. This is right. So an entire literature around these ideological revisions. That's a pretty strong signal that the group is no longer violent. They dismantled their armed wing. They completely disarmed in that sense. They proclaimed a nonviolent initiative. So all of those signals taken together, you can really see that the group has fully shifted away from armed resistance.
So before we dive deep into the findings and what questions you raise, I'm curious about your process of research. How did you go about documenting the tactics of these groups, and how do you determine what influences the changes that they undergo?
Yeah, so the tracking violence is probably the easiest because that's what everybody pays attention to, right? That's what's included in the terrorism databases. That's what's in the news. That's what's in the other literature that talks about these groups. So there's a lot of evidence for the violence. The slightly more difficult part is tracking the ideological changes and tracking the organizational changes. But for all the groups, there was evidence out there, so you could find the evidence. Um, it I Since I'm doing case studies, so I traveled to Egypt and to Indonesia. I did interviews with members or former members of the groups, um, to kind of understand their own to get a glimpse of their own understanding of these processes and how they understood them. And then I used what I call a technique a method that's called process tracing. And with process tracing, what you basically do is you play detective in a way where you think about all the possible explanations and you create this detailed timeline of what happened and the sequence in which things happen. And then at the critical moments where you see change, especially change in these things that I'm interested in, change in the ideological justification, change in the behavior, change in the organizational structure, you look at all the possible explanations and at all the evidence that you can find, and you think, well, what best explains this outcome, right? So you kind of go through these moments of change to really think about, well, if it's this, then what do we expect to see? And if it's this, what do we expect to see? So that's how you retrace the story. So what I do in each of the cases, I retrace the story and focus on these moments of change. And then I kind of think through the geopolitical context, think through look at the organizational context, look at um, what was happening at that particular point in time to tell a story of how these groups changed and why.
One of perhaps the most interesting discussions in your book is about the effect of repression, of government repression of these groups. And you find that it can lead both to escalation in many cases, but also sometimes to de-escalation. So what factors affect this perhaps seemingly contradictory finding, and how can we maybe try to predict what outcome repression will have? What other things are in play there?
Right, and that was what motivated me actually to do this this project in these cases, is because you had before I started this, you had a literature that was arguing that repression is a major cause of radicalization, and then separately a literature that was arguing, look, repression can lead to de-radicalization. And that was why I wanted to look at the trajectory of a group over time to understand, well, how can it be both? How can repression both radicalize and de-radicalize? And part of the story is, again, this sequence. When does repression come? Does it come in the beginning, in the early life cycle of a group? Does it come after a group has been around? Does it come before a group has adopted violence? After the group has adopted violence, it can lead to a farther escalation, right? A tit for tat violence. Um, and so this is how I parse the effects that it can have. So what we see is that early on, when a group is nonviolent, repression can really lead to a lot of grievances, and it can lead to a justification for violence. Now, the justification for violence can also come from other policies that the group doesn't like. Um, and repression can be enough to put that if the group has justified violence and has come to a point where it it offers a framework for understanding when violence is acceptable within their kind of normative um, normative framework. Repression can put that external pressure on the group to resort to violent tactics. Um, Violent tactics. Once a group resorts to violence, there you invariably see this tit for tat escalation because states respond quite harshly to violence. And then in response, the groups also escalate. So a lot of times you see this escalation between the group and the state, um, that leads to increasing levels of violence. After a while, that can be devastating for a group. So when repression has de-radicalizing effects, it's always after it. It's usually well, I shouldn't say de-radicalizing effects, when repression can contribute to the dynamics of de-escalation, right? Because repression in and of itself doesn't have de-radicalizing effects. It can severely weaken a group. So after a while, repression can really weaken a group, to the point of, I mean, if all the leaders are either killed or in jail, if the members are persecuted, if they're oppressed, um, if they're pursued by the state and arrested, it's very difficult to operate. And this is where you see this, that groups are both principled and strategic. It's part of the story is that the group is weakened. And obviously no strategic actor wants to be weakened. But part of the story is that it also matters for the members that they cannot pursue what they perceive as their religious mission. They cannot pursue the social services, the religious study groups, in the face of such repression. So when groups are incredibly weakened by the repression, that's when they may abandon violence if the public is also condemning that violence. So it's not just about what the state does and the level of repression, is also about the norms of resistance in the general public, right? And that's when you can see de-escalation. The group is severely weakened, but the violence is also condemned by the public, and the group is facing pressure both from the state and from the general public that is starting to see them as terrorists, as pursuing violence, as damaging rather than helping the population.
So maybe zooming out a bit, you mentioned 4 variables that you investigate to kind of look at how these groups calculate whether escalation or de-escalation would be advantageous. Group repression and, as you just mentioned, public attitudes are 2 of these, and the other 2 are policy convergence with the government and organizational strength. So maybe you can talk a bit about these, and I'm also wondering if any of them are much, much more significant than the others in ultimately determining what actions a group takes, or are they all in play with each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think of them as interacting, but some are more background variables and some are more triggering variables. So, um, policy convergence, what I mean by that is, does the government pursue policies that the group approves of, or does the government pursue policies that the group finds as either, you know, not, well, at best, not desirable, at worst, an offense to their religious vision, right? Um, because again, if we think of these groups as actually principled organization, then what policies the government pursues actually matters in terms of their desire or their perceived need to escalate activism and to do more than just religious study groups and social services, right? If the government is acting in an offensive way, there's a perceived need to do something about it, to respond to these policies that are seen as an affront to their religious mission, or as an affront to the Muslim community, or as an affront to um, the vitality of the Muslim community. Um, that in and of itself was in none of the cases was that enough to drive a group to violence. It was always a background factor that you start seeing more discussion, heightened activism, heightened awareness that something needs to happen, heightened awareness that they need to actually organize politically and not just socially and religiously. So important, I think, important to think about, but not a factor that ever was the kind of, haha, this is what drove this group to pursue violence, right? Or this is what drove the group to abandon violence. So it was never the case that undesirable policies directly drove the group to violence, and it was definitely never the case that if the government ever pursued policies that could have been seen as in line with a religious vision. If because a lot of times these governments kind of try to appeal to the religious, sentiments of the community more generally. It was never the case that when the government pursued any policies that were actually in line with these groups, the groups laid down arms. That's not what drove them to lay down arms, right? At least in the 4 cases that I'm looking at. So that's an important factor to understand, but I think it's more in the background. Um, the public and norms of resistance, similarly, I think are very important because groups operate in a particular social context, and the way that they think about what's acceptable, what the repertoire of activism is in any particular context is always in line with what other groups are doing. So again, that is shaping how groups think about tactics, what kind of tactics groups consider, but it's not one of those trigger factors that drives them to use violence or to abandon violence. Repression and organizational dynamics are, and what's happening within the organization are much more powerful determinants of their actual behavior in that sense. So, I talked a little bit about repression. In terms of organizational dynamics, there are times when groups are fairly cohesive, they act fairly uniformly, and there are other times when there is a lot of internal turmoil. There's a lot of debates, there's disagreements, ideological disagreements on how to respond to a political crisis, whether to use violence, whether not to use violence, whether to abandon violence, whether not to abandon violence. Those internal tensions can push groups towards or away from violence in different ways, right? So if there is a strong faction within the group that thinks it's time to use violence, that can be a motivation to start using violence, especially if it's in combination with repression, right? So if you have both the internal pressure and the external pressure to use violence, that can push a group to use violence. But alternatively, if you have a radical faction that wants to use violence, but then that faction actually breaks away, that can also enable the group to remain nonviolent if the leaders are very much against shifting towards armed resistance at any particular point in time. Eliminating that radical faction can allow them to maintain nonviolence, and it's kind of opening a pressure valve, right? So all the radical members and the radical factions can break away from the group. Um, so that's how I see these four interacting.
So 3 of the 4 groups that you study end up adopting quite a high degree of de-escalation in the end. So I'm curious about what different paths they take and what that might say about the overall process.
Yeah, so the Muslim Brotherhood, which is kind of the main group that I study and the one that I started out the project with, they had the most minimal form of escalation out of all the groups. So for them, the de-escalation was almost like a natural process because it started out as a nonviolent movement. To the extent that its members resorted to violence inside Egypt, it was never officially sanctioned by the movement, or at the very least, there are strong debates to this day about the extent to which the violence of its members was sanctioned by the movement. So the Brotherhood always understood itself as primarily a nonviolent movement. So when it had a radical group emerging within the prison cells, it was and it was easier to kind of have that splinter off, and for the main leaders of the movement to reassert a nonviolent vision once they came out of the prison in the 1970s. And since then, the Brotherhood has been a nonviolent movement. Now, of course, after the repression in 2013, that question of violence reemerges. And there's a history there to go back to, right? And there's ideologues within the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood to go back to, um, and a model to go back to for inspiration. And in after 2013, it once again caused quite a lot of internal discussion and debate and fragmentation within the Brotherhood. Inside Egypt, there was some violent escalation. It was very limited. It was very clear, and it very clearly kind of delineated. It couldn't have been against civilians. It couldn't have been against not even against politicians, right? And that was also only sanctioned by a certain group of leaders, but the key leaders of the Brotherhood always rejected violence and rejected it in 2013 and denied it after 2013, denied that any of the violence that was emerging was in any way approved by the movement leaders or the key leaders. They vehemently kind of stood by their motto that our peacefulness is stronger than their bullets, that we really need to remain steadfast and nonviolent. But it was, again, in response to severe repression, it was there, it reemerged. But the Brotherhood is the clearest case of a nonviolent movement that at times members and factions moved towards violence, but then it was easier to remain a nonviolent movement. Al-Islamiya'a in Egypt was perhaps the most violent out of all the groups, and its very emergence was very much in response to the nonviolence of the Brotherhood. It emerged on campuses in reaction to the nonviolence of the Brotherhood as the radical student movement that wanted to liberate Egypt from what it saw as a tyrannical regime. It started with the assassination of President Sadat in 1981. Afterwards, in response to the repression, it escalated. It eventually targeted tourists and engaged in large-scale terrorist attacks. A lot of violence from the ranks of Jemaah Islamiyya, but it also reached a point where the group itself was severely weakened. The public was treating it and perceiving it as a terrorist group and condemning it of terrorism. So internally it faced a lot of the group was decimated. Externally, it was condemned by everyone. So it reached a point where the leaders announced a nonviolent initiative. And there's a long story there about, the government had been sending clergymen to the prisons for years, trying to work with the leaders and convince them to renounce violence. But it also refused, and their demand at first was, improve conditions in the prisons, and the government refused. So after years and years of attempts at negotiation, when the government kind of gave up on that, the leaders announced their nonviolent initiative, and afterwards they worked with those clerics that had initially convinced them to renounce violence to revise their ideology, to publish volumes of ideological revisions, and then they toured the prisons to convince their members of these new ideological tenets and dismantle the armed wing and completely shifted away from armed resistance. So, and they were pretty much inactive until the Arab uprising. After the Arab uprising, they formed a political party, and it's a Salafi party, building and development party, and they very much have stayed a nonviolent movement and a party since then. In Indonesia, Jemaah Islamiyya, in some ways, underwent a similar story, known for the Bali attacks, very high-profile terrorist attacks, and then again, some of its members engaged in a lot of other highly visible terrorist attacks, but there was always a debate about who was actually organizing these attacks and where were the decisions made. Were they directives from the top leaders, or were these the people who were organizing these attacks, were they actually going against the leadership? So there's quite a bit of discussion about the violence that GI undertook and the extent to which it actually represented the decisions of the group or decisions of individual leaders who were eventually splintering off from the group. But the group itself renounced violence. And it was at first just behavioral, but actually more recently they also announced a much more comprehensive disengagement from violence and dismantling. So it's also a similar story to the Egyptian story, where it was severely weakened by government counterterrorism policies. Their actions were widely condemned by the Indonesian public. Internally, there was a lot of fragmentation. The most radical members basically splintered off and broke off. So the group disengaged from violence completely.
You mention violent rhetoric and also building military capabilities as quote-unquote sticky choices. What does this mean, and what are the implications for de-escalation?
Yeah, well, once you offer a justification for violence, it's hard to then control the behavior of individuals, right? Once you try to convince them that targeting these particular politicians or these particular groups of people is legitimate because of XYZ, is justifiable because XYZ, is even advisable because XYZ, well, then it's going to be much harder to go back on that and say that, well, maybe not now, right? And so once you've legitimized a tactic, you kind of have to own that, right? For your members, you have to expect that your members will believe you and will follow your guideline here. No, again, these groups have revised their arguments, right? But that also shows why these are sticky choices. It's not that they can just simply say, that's it, we're not engaging in violence anymore. It takes intentionality and it takes effort, and so with the GI, right, they toured the prisons and had extensive discussions about why the ideological revisions and what was the nature of the revisions and why did their violence fail, and why is it time now to move away from violence and to a different model. And it's the same thing with building an armed wing. That's also a sticky choice because it requires arming people, training people in military tactics, training them how to use those guns. And once you have an armed wing that has been trained for battle, they're going to expect battle, right? It's in a way, it's almost like playing with fire. You build the organizational capacity to undertake violence. Well, there's an entity that expects to be ready to fight. So there's that entity will always have a propensity to act. And then from the organizational perspective, you then have to think about, how do you control it? How do you have it only use violence when the top leadership decides that it's the appropriate context to use violence? How do you scale back the violence? How do you escalate, right? But how do you control it's in these cases, it was always men, but how do you control the men with guns once you've trained them and told them that it's time to act? So that's what I mean, but they're by their sticky choices. Once you arm your people for violence, and once you amp them up for violence, those are sticky choices. It's hard to it's not impossible. These groups have done it, but it is much harder to walk back from these choices.
I want to end by asking if you think that the framework that you develop and that you use could be expanded to analyze groups that are not necessarily religious groups or that might have different origins or structures than the groups that you look at. So, for instance, the PKK in Turkey recently renounced its use of violence and is now in talks to hopefully have some sort of peace deal with the Turkish government. Is the presence of some sort of religious doctrine essential for breaking escalation down into ideological, organizational, and behavioral spheres, or can that be replaced by something like nationalism or other sort of still emotionally laden things?
I think it definitely is transferable. The way that I approach Islamist groups in this book is they are one category. So I say that they're principled and pragmatic. In this case, their principles are religious principles, but I think they could easily be other types of principles, right? Nationalist, ethno-nationalist, Marxist, anarchist, right? So to me, I think that the framework that I offer and the mechanisms that I talk about are very much generalizable. There's nothing unique about Islamist actors, and the Islamist actors that I talk about. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean that we don't need to take their values seriously, right? But those values can be different. Those ideologies can be different. The way that they justify armed resistance or nonviolent resistance are meaningful, but it can be done in a religious or non-religious framework. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, I had a thought, but I lost it.
Well, that is all the time we have for today. If you're interested, Emy's book, The Violence Pendulum, Tactical Change in Islamist Groups in Egypt and Indonesia, can be purchased through the link on the New Books Network page. Thanks again for coming on today.
Thank you.